I think the best fractional executives are seen by their clients as members of the team, and therefore they need to experience high availability and they need to believe you fully understand their priorities. But in order to do that, you have to continually sieve the important from the urgent. And the risk is that you can lose sight of operational urgency while you try and drive lasting capability improvement. So that's why it's so crucial. Don't think there's anybody I've ever worked with who I've not said to them, now try charging a bit more.
Yeah.
Don't go in at that level. Go in at that level and offer a discount. Set
Yeah.
it higher. And why do I say that? It's not because I'm greedy or I want them to be greedy. It's because they're worth it and they do more interesting work for more interesting clients if they charge more. I think for me, I really like that matrix, which is urgent first is important, and keep coming back to that because you can't build anything of lasting value if you only do the urgent.
Absolutely.
Provides you with a very good lens to have different kinds of conversations with clients because part of the reason you're there is to help them build the important and not only to deliver on the urgent.
Welcome to the Fractional Frontier, where we explore the future of leadership in today's evolving business landscape. I'm Lorraine Carter here with Charles McLachlan, and every week we dive deep into the world of high-performing fractional executives and the businesses that leverage them.
Whether you're an experienced fractional leader or a business decision maker seeking top tier talent, this is the place to be for actionable insights, strategies, and stories from the front lines of fractional leadership.
And today we're focusing on balancing multiple portfolios and insights on time management and prioritization so that you're performing at your highest, both in terms of yourself and your client. So, Charles, can you briefly share with us about how you've developed your views on balancing multiple portfolios and insights on time management prioritization so you can deliver at your best?
Yes, I think it's something that has come to me very early on in my career because I've worked in technical and professional services businesses all my working life. People for money businesses is what I say. And very quickly, you have to learn how to balance client service, business development, people development, and self development. You've always got those four things going on. But typically, you'll only have one primary client at any one time. More recently, as I've built up my own portfolio activities and worked with other portfolio workers, I realized there are different tensions when working with multiple clients, particularly if you're offering an executive leadership service.
Yeah. And without balancing to match your service promise and to deliver on client needs, there's a big risk that you disappoint your existing clients and potentially new ones. And simply, you run the risk of simple burnout because you're just mismanaging or overpromising. So I believe that I wouldn't necessarily say terribly simplistic, but look at a more structured way of how you manage your days and your clients so that it doesn't get out of control and that you can deliver at your best. So today we're going to share a bit more around how you can manage that more effectively to ensure that you balance the urgent with the important and that you fulfill and exceed client expectations across your full portfolio. So, for our listeners who may not be familiar, Charles, can you explain why balancing portfolios is so important to the fractional executive and their clients?
So I think the best fractional executives are seen by their clients as members of the team.
Mm.
And therefore, they need to experience high availability
Hmm.
and they need to believe you fully understand their priorities. But in order to do that, you have to continually sieve the important from the urgent. And the risk is that you can lose sight of operational urgency while you try and drive lasting capability improvement. So that's why it's so crucial.
Certainly, when I reflect on all the different clients I've worked with in different locations, internationally, and also different scales and sizes of organizations, sometimes you just even have to understand come from a cultural reference point, because your Anglo reference point on urgency may not be the same as it is from an American or an Eastern European perspective or a South African perspective. So understanding how that's interpreted is a is a really important starting point uh, for everybody, because it's very easy to have misunderstandings, and nobody's happy. So I mean, I can think of occasions when simply it's just a misunderstanding culturally around what urgent means. And that urgency can actually be driven because you understand, as the fractional executive, that there's got to be a certain sort of set of things done and delivered within a certain context and time frame to meet an overall strategic objective. But the client may not realize that there's a snowball effect or a domino effect of what needs to be achieved. So part of, say, our simple responsibility and not owning managing our own time, but is also establishing a relevant context for the client to operationally understand what needs to be done so that everybody is on board in terms of that time commitment on efficiently getting things done to achieve those outcomes, because the role as a fractional executive is not just strategic, it's also supporting things operationally and in terms of application and development and upskilling. And all of that has to work together effectively.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
to give you a specific example of where I saw something that didn't go right,
Yeah.
I've been working with for a long time who's very experienced FD,
Yeah.
and he was working with a very driven business leader.
Yeah.
For most of his time, as long as things happened in the accounting cycle, it was absolutely fine. So,
Mhm.
as long as the monthly reports came out and the quarterly reports and the annual reports, and there's a whole cycle in accounting, and he was very good at that cycle. But it came to a point in the business's development where they were now planning an exit, and suddenly there was an urgency that we get the business model refined, or we do some projections for an investor or whatever. And that was a pace, an urgency that he wasn't used to, and he hadn't experienced this sort of corporate finance type environment. So he
Mhm.
didn't even realize that now those kinds of people, it's always, but if you can't do it yesterday, why didn't you do it the day before? It's that kind of world when people are investors. So those people have got very short um, tolerance, and they believe that you should be incredibly grateful they want to buy your company, and therefore you should do anything, anytime to make it work, even though they may take a long time to take a decision. So he completely missed that change in pace. He
Mm.
completely missed that some things were going to be very urgent. And ultimately, that made it very difficult for him to support that transaction. And
Mm.
actually, the CEO there brought in a corporate finance person alongside him to
Mm.
actually support the transaction. But I also have a very personal experience, which was quite bruising for me. Not
Oh.
when I was working as a fractional, but I was brought in to turn around a business, and they had a culture that came from broadcasting. And the culture from broadcasting is you should never have what they call dead air. There should never be silent. And I spent all weekend building a very complex proposal. Uh,
Mm.
and it became clearer and clearer to me that actually we could never win this work. And I looked at the criteria, but they were very distressed that I made a decision to no bid rather than bid, even though we had no chance of winning, and even though I'd have to stay up for another night. So again, that was just misunderstanding what was really important to them. And from their point of view, it was more important that we submitted a bid than that we won the bid, which was a bit strange for me, from my background. So getting those things right is something we learn, but I think we can still get it very badly wrong. Do you have any other horror stories, Lorraine?
Well, I certainly, anytime things have gone wrong, it's because there hasn't been a clear structure or framework, uh, at the very beginning to be really clear around boundaries and scope, while at the same time we can always expand on this, but it has to be agreed within what we can do in order to fulfill that within a doable time frame. So that is so critical. Anytime things that have gone, in my experience, that have gone off the rails is because there's not a clarity around, and there is obligations on both sides because you're working as part of a team. You're not just an external consultant. So it's about understanding what the mutual obligations are in both contexts for a successful outcome for everybody and for the business. So what kind of frameworks or approaches have you used or are you using, Charles, in that context for helping fractional executives or even yourself balance multiple portfolios?
I think for me, I really like that matrix, which is urgent versus important,
Mm-hmm.
and keep coming back to that. Uh,
Mm,
because you can't build anything of lasting value if you only do the urgent.
absolutely.
Provides you with a very good lens to have different kinds of conversations with clients. Because part of the reason you're there is to help them build the important and not only to deliver on the urgent.
Yeah.
Second thing is, I think, like my FD friend, try and build rhythms into your relationship.
Mm,
So you are a member of the executive team as a fractional.
mm,
Try and build a regular rhythm of executive team meetings,
mm-hmm.
of team meetings for your team. So they generally happen at the same time each month. And then the meetings, those kinds of meetings need to be very well prepared for. So you get
Mm,
the most done in the meetings. But you have to distinguish between that kind of interaction and I suppose what I would see more as sort of coaching, mentoring interaction, where there you're coming alongside and it's much more free form and it's much more um, developmental.
yeah.
And that can sometimes be support you're giving to the CEO or to your fellow executives, where you're bringing your wisdom and insight from a whole range of different experiences, whereas perhaps they've only worked in a smaller number of contexts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So creating the space for that kind of call, I think, is very important, and we can lose that if we get too agenda driven.
And it also helps, I think, from my experience, if you even label them and explain what the function is in each one of those so that the team you're working with and the client understands what that kind of working session is going to look like, whether it's highly structured meeting or whether it is a facilitated working session or whether it's a mentoring session or if something that's strategic with a longer term input, or whether it's something that you're dealing with, something that's critical, that's very time sensitive, or even a crisis. And those are all very different uses of terms of how you approach to the level of structure or fluidity within that working environment. But yes, I would agree with you in terms of building those into your planning time and then the kind of working dynamic in that occasion makes a huge difference around everybody's expectations and how they actually come, prepared or otherwise.
Yeah, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that in some fractional roles, there is a strong project orientation.
Mhm.
So, for marketing people, there's often a campaign
Mm,
or an event, and that feels much more like a project.
mm,
Um, Again, for people who are in CTO roles, there are often quite a strong project orientation. And it's tempting to see the whole job as running the project.
mm.
But actually, you need to partition the project rhythm from your wider responsibilities to build capability.
Yes.
And what I've seen people do is not set clear personal boundaries so that they end up being the sort of go-to person about every issue in the project
Mm,
rather than providing overall governance and guidance,
mhm,
but also not being clear about which tasks they're delegating to other members of the team or which other members of other teams need to be accountable for their part in it. So it's very easy for you because you're seen as a sort of option resource, just
Mm.
mopping up all the other things that aren't working. Uh,
Yeah,
and very quickly that can become a burnout situation.
totally. Plus, quite simply, you're not empowering or enabling the team if you're not transferring that capability and the knowledge around how to deal with it. And if you're not delegating effectively with that upskilled resource, then that's underserving both you and the business overall.
I think the other thing I found quite powerful is actually to treat key people in the team that I'm leading
Mm,
as people who you're taking responsibility for their professional development.
hmm
So you set them clear goals about how they need to develop,
mm,
alongside how they need to do the job.
mm,
And that gives them more personal responsibility for their own performance rather
mm,
than constantly saying, oh, well, I can't do this. Can you help me? Ultimately, I suppose the role of every fractional is to work themselves out of a job because the team will grow big enough and the organization they work with will be successful enough that they need a full-term person. So you need to start with that mindset from day one, I believe.
Absolutely. And I actually would be very upfront in saying that with a client and say, ultimately, the objective here is that you'll get to a point in time where you actually don't need, because you will have upskilled enough or brought somebody on board, and the business will have grown enough to sustain that, or you might just dip into that expertise with something more strategic periodically. But so I would actually be quite upfront with that, because if we're not doing that, then I don't believe we're actually delivering properly on what that fractional remit is. So, Charles, how do you respond when a client appears to have an urgent crisis and what they're interpreting may not be how you would perceive it from an urgent crisis point of view?
Well, I think we're in quite a privileged position because the client, the CEO or the senior director that you're reporting to, a crisis to them can be a sort of existential threat, can't it? Their whole career, as they see it, rests on this being successfully navigated. And so they've got a different kind of skin in the game.
Yeah.
I worked very closely with a guy who spent his life dealing with crises. It was his responsibility to talk people down when they wanted to jump off Beachy Head. So he was having crises every single day. Um, and what he realized is that managing his own emotions and then
Mm,
supporting the other person to recognize how they feel and start to manage their emotions had to happen before any other kind of progress came in.
yeah.
And some leaders, particularly in high energy startups, actually they thrive on a sense of crisis. They need the crisis to motivate them and their team. So they
Mm,
want a crisis because if there's no crisis, they're not feeling busy enough or they're not feeling they're making enough progress. And surprisingly, I've seen this kind of pattern in litigation practices as well. So when I was doing expert witness work with lawyers, lawyers would always leave it to the last possible moment and a bit after, before the court deadline, because they love this sense of we've got to work all the way through the night. So there are personality types who want the energy from a crisis. It feeds something in them. Um, but I think the other thing is, I always say to my fractionals, ensure you've got some discretionary time. Now, if you're charging a fixed fee every month, um, then you have an expectation in your mind about how much effort you're going to put in.
mm,
But usually you're going to be very well rewarded anyway. And so you do need to make sure you've got enough spare time in your whole life that when that client is having a real crisis, you can respond, you can be there with him, you can support him through it. And that's what builds the lasting trust. And
yeah.
you've been through the fire together, then you're just another helper. But going through the fire together, being there with him, and sometimes, kinds of relationships that the people I work with form with their clients means actually, alongside being invited to the staff party, they may also be invited to their daughter's wedding, or they might be alerted to a death in the family. So it's about having that level of trust and confidence that actually you can talk about more than just getting the job done.
I would agree with all of that, but certainly the culture of, and I'm suggesting this is culture. Do you think then in a situation whereby what you've described in that legal scenario, that startup scenario, and then every organization, particularly an earlier one or even large one, organizations are typically not, it's not unusual for them to look to how they optimize and improve culture. Because at the end of the day, if the culture of an organization is not a really positive environment, that's when you will lose people. And the strength of an organization is really based entirely on the strength of its people. So there is also a situation whereby that level of pressure could also be regarded as somewhat toxic ongoing environment to work in from some perspectives. So have you ever had a situation where you were even considering, well, is there a potential need to change that? If the trigger is constantly to work in this high adrenaline situation, which isn't always the best then if you want to have a more reflective strategic perspective or level of input.
Well, I think that's very true. If they are founder, owner managed businesses or owner led businesses,
Mm,
then they will tend to set the pattern from the top.
yeah.
And they will expect other people to respond to their need for extensive business.
Mm,
I think part of our role is to help them to understand that activity and outcome are not directly related. Sometimes you can get a better outcome through less activity.
yeah.
And that's a huge issue for those individuals to make that change because somehow their whole sense of self worth is caught up in the fact I'm very, very busy. If I'm
Mm,
very, very busy, what I'm doing must be very, very important. And nobody else could do it. And that tends to put a cap on their ability to build a team around them. But it can be extremely hard. Um, I'm thinking of a guy, founded a business out of the ashes of another business where his previous business partner had been a disaster.
mhm,
Um, Very driven to build this new business.
mm,
Not surprisingly, he had trust issues about whether anybody could do stuff as well as he could.
mhm,
And the only way over time for me to support him as an advisor to the CEO was start to bring very good people around him as fractional.
yeah.
People that he knew were much better at the job they were doing than he was.
Yeah.
You'd still want to second guess them. You'd still have an opinion. You'd still
Mm,
say, oh, well, I would have done that anyway. But over time, by having very, very good people that were better than him, he was able to let go. Um, and that's one of the opportunities you have as a fractional, I think, is you can have extremely good people who can give confidence to a founder leader to let
mm.
go.
Um, and it takes a level of maturity, personal development, and emotional intelligence to actually be able to move to that place where you actually are recognizing that shortcoming, uh, not only for yourself, but for the business that you're building.
Yeah. And I think they start to realize that they they can't sustain a 90-hour week, 52 weeks a year, and whoever they share their lives with won't allow them to either. Um, and so things start to shift or break down, one or the other.
Yeah.
Still, people well past their earliest years can maintain that pace and become addicted to it.
Yeah.
Um,
Addiction is a very actually important word there because it can be highly addictive.
and so, and helping to make that transition without having a crisis is very difficult. There's a crisis, then it's obvious, but often they can keep themselves just below crisis point.
I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday who was saying, his 60, 70 hours a week just aren't sustainable, particularly with very young children. He's trying to figure his way forward in terms of, and we were just doing an analysis across the different customers in the business and what he could do to manage that in terms of the really high value enterprise clients versus the mid tier versus the small ones that bring in a certain kind of regular income but don't need a high level input. And I'm just saying, well, where in this mix does there need to be a bit of give because you can't sustain this indefinitely and your young family needs to be able to see you. Otherwise, what's it all about?
But sadly, what I've seen is if they go cold turkey, suddenly have that withdrawn from them,
Mm.
then that's almost as dangerous as
Yeah.
their body says, okay, I can relax now. And all of those things that I wanted to allow to go wrong can now go wrong.
So, so one of the questions that's come up from our listeners, Charles, is what do I do when a client asks for much more of my time? And that can mean lots of different things. So I have a perspective on how that is, but I'd be interested to hear yours. What, in your experience, have you done when you're asked for that?
Well, I think it's hugely flattering when a client wants more of your time. So, and it's very tempting to give them more of your time.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's three things that I would always say to a portfolio executive. One is you do not want to end up over dependent on one client.
Yes.
The second thing is if they're asking for more of your time, you're not charging enough
Mm.
because you should be so expensive that it's obvious that rather than asking you to do something, they should hire somebody to do who's cheaper to do that thing. And the third thing is actively help the client to plan the recruitment of other people in your team
Yeah.
so that actually they don't need more of your time because you're bringing up, the number three, the number two, the number one, you're fanning out the capability. Um, and simply because I'm very familiar with that environment, if you think about a finance director,
Hmm.
if you've got a finance director and a bookkeeper, there's two or three middle layers that are not in place. The finance director should not be preparing the management accounts. The
Yeah.
finance director should not be chasing up people who haven't paid. The finance director should not be doing the payroll. So
Mm.
that, but sometimes when you start out as a fractional finance director in a smaller client, all they have is a reporting accountant who produces quarterly ma- management accounts and year-end statutory accounts, and that's it.
Mm.
You go in there and say, okay, well, I'll start doing the bookkeeping. You shot yourself in the foot. And even when you've got a bookkeeper, you probably want somebody who's going to help part-time to do the management accounts so you can focus on the strategic stuff. It may seem obvious, but I've seen people so often get trapped in because they are there, because they're being well paid. They want to go
Mm.
that extra mile and do stuff that actually is not serving the client in the long term and certainly not serving them in the short term.
That sums up very well where often on the odd occasion when that has come up, the opening question is, what do you really think is the best use of my time and how could we potentially look at how that could actually be addressed within the resource in the team with some upskilling or bringing another member on? Um, because getting that reflection back on that question is then answering some of what you've just said there, because the easy thing potentially with the fractional is say, well, can you do this, but it's not necessarily the best resource either. And absolutely, if somebody is asking that, then you're absolutely right. Maybe your fees need to be reconsidered.
Well, I spend a lot of my time encouraging the people I work with to increase their fees because I love working with great people, but they don't often realize how great they are.
Yes, that is extremely true, very much so. uh, And do you see, just because this came up in some work I was doing in the last couple of weeks or so and came up through some stats, do you see that in terms of there being that bias slightly where you will see that undervaluation of self appear more amongst women than guys, or is it equal? Because very interesting that came up in a conversation in the last week or so with some very interesting statistics around it too.
I'm not sure that I've seen a pattern where there's a difference between men and women in the fractional space.
Okay.
The thing that I've seen in the fractional space is that often women think they need to get yet another qualification
Yeah.
in order to be good enough to do the next thing. They always want to do the next master's program or the next specialist course or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
whereas men are more likely to just do it and believe they can learn it on the job. Um,
Yeah.
and I think they're both right. It is good to get formal training.
Hmm.
Don't need the formal training to do the job. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that's the bigger issue I would suggest as a difference between men and women. I don't think there's anybody I've ever worked with who I've not said to them, now try charging a bit more.
Yeah.
Don't go in at that level. Go in at that level and offer a discount. Set
Yeah.
it higher. And why do I say that? It's not because I'm greedy or I want them to be greedy. It's because they're worth it and they do more interesting work for more interesting clients if they charge more.
Yes.
That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
I suppose the other thing I'd be really interested in, Lorraine, because this is something that people often ask me, is how you learnt to rapidly switch from one client context to another. If you're working with several clients on one day,
Hmm.
sort of get the other hat on or the other head on. I mean, you're doing that often in a multicultural context where you might be talking to an Irish client in the morning and a Danish client in the evening and an American client at night or whatever it is. I mean, how do you do that context switch?
I literally have to almost compartmentalize, and I'm switching straight away into back into what's the headspace in this jurisdiction. So it's not even just cultural across listen different geographic. It also can be also across different sectors, because there are the nuances of the way different sectors behave, the pace at which they move, the dynamics around which how things are done. So because I've worked and continue to work across so many different sectors as well as different jurisdictions, it's literally a case of box off that and you're moving it back into this space. So it's like all those things immediately have to be brought into bear, and it's like you're looking through a filter every time, depending on the context of the geographic location and the culture. Uh, because it would be a shambles otherwise if you took what you might do in an Irish context and you brought it to an Eastern European context or vice versa. And you have to bring to bear, like, well, this is how they approach things in South Africa versus in Dublin or Bucharest. And you've just got to kind of really look at that in terms of what does that mean? What are the boundaries? How are things being done? The elasticity around that expectation or thought, or so it's literally compartmentalizing in terms of stepping back into that location or jurisdiction mentally, or that particular sector.
Yeah, I think
That's how I manage it. I haven't found another way of managing it.
yeah, it's probably one of the biggest contrasts I've found is um, working with charity leaders,
Mm.
then having a conversation with somebody who's involved with property development, and then having a conversation with somebody who is trying to uh, launch a new software product. And one of the things that helps me actually is, for some reason, the dog we've got at home learnt when a call is coming to an end. As the call is coming to an end, as you do that sort of polite wind up to show people that you're not going to carry on talking forever. There's a whole set of cues we give people, isn't there? Particularly on Zoom. So when you notice that the call is about to come to an end, he will come and demand my attention. And so I sort of break out of one context, give the dog a good rub on the tummy into the next one. So that's my context breaking effort.
That's hilarious. But
It's,
no, as somebody who doesn't have a pet at home, my work is as much virtual as it is in physical sense. But sometimes it does get tiring because you're having to move so dynamically. And that comes back to then how do you schedule your time, uh, jumping across different things so that your head is in the right place, which can be a sector as much as it is geographic. And that comes back to, well, how do you manage your time?
yeah,
Uh, and also, is this a real strategic input, or is it a mentoring and upskilling or facilitated input, or is this a check-in on where things are at? It's a different energy as well as headspace. So it's all back to managing and structuring that again.
and I think one of the opportunities you have as a fractional is to recognize the different kind of work that suits you at different times of day. I spend quite a lot of time with people saying, okay, if you're going to have a really difficult conversation with a client, when are you at best, your best for that?
Mm.
If you're going to have an open, sharing, learning, developmental conversation, is that best when you've had a good lunch and you can sit there and wax lyrical? How
Mm.
suits you? And if you're trying to get a piece of work finished
Mm.
that needs to go out the door, is it going to suit you better to start and do that between 8 o'clock in the evening and 10 o'clock at night? Because then you're uninterrupted and everything flows. So helping people, now they've got the freedom to how they use their time, helping people then to be very intentional about what they do when in the day can make a huge difference.
It's also about understanding and recognizing when are the optimum times in a 24-hour period for whatever it is, the nature of the kind of work that you're doing. But it's also balancing that against when is the optimum time for whatever that kind of piece of work is
Yeah.
with the client as well. And the time that is best suited for that as well, because, it might be high energy input, strategic thinking, that might be best for everybody done early in the morning. But if you're working across different time zones, your early in the morning may not fit with the client's early in the morning.
And I think the other thing is always try and find out what my client's drive time is, because that often is the time when you can have those quiet on the side conversations as they go into work in the morning or as they come home in the evening. Share with them some of the stuff that may not be time critical, but is often important background information for them to reflect on before they come into work the following morning.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you on all that. Yeah. And that's when you can actually have that flexibility of that high touch input, which is very sensitive to the optimum time for the client, which is very much valued and appreciated by the client.
So, what advice would you give us to the most important lesson that you've learned about balancing between multiple clients, Lorraine?
We've discussed here the different types of energy inputs and the different types of work, whether it's strategic, facilitated, hands-on implementation. So having a level of clarity around when your energy is at best for those different types of outputs, but then also recognizing what is also the best fit for the organization you're working with, the people in it, and most importantly, the decision maker. And then also the layer of the cultural nuances too, of where you're geographically working. Like, but I've worked, say, in Romania, and so Scandinavian countries like to start early. Their day starts early, but that doesn't necessarily fit with, say, Romanian. That for them an early start is 9:30.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're in parts of Scandinavia, they're up, they're going at 6 in the mornings. So you've also got to balance those different cultural differences too. So it's really about being clear about how you're going to structure your time to not only so you can work at your best, but also so that the teams you're working with can as well, and the decision makers, particularly when you want to have those quieter conversations, reflective, strategic conversations just with the CEO.
Yeah, and I think that's going to become more and more important actually, because over time, what I'm seeing is that even quite small organizations are operating in multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah.
The classic solopreneur might have a virtual assistant in the Philippines. They might have somebody who's doing video editing for them in South Africa, and they might have somebody doing project management for them in Mexico. And
Yeah.
even then, they're just one fee earner, and they've still got a team that's distributed across the globe. But the other side of this, I think, which is going to make it more challenging for us, I think, as fractionals, is an increasing return to in-person events.
Yes.
There was a time where I didn't really need to turn up very often.
Hmm.
I'm starting to see that clients increasingly want contact time, physical one-to-one time. They're starting to realize how much they miss live the difference between living in a Zoom world and an office environment or a shared space. So I think fractionals are going to have to adapt and be prepared, perhaps, for each of their clients to be on site as often as once a month. Whereas in the past, they might have been able to get away with something every 2 or 3 months and do almost everything virtually.
Yeah, I would agree with that because, yes, I've certainly worked with clients whereby we're working on a weekly basis, but I'm physically seeing them 3 or 4 times a year. But I also would agree that there's subtle nuances of being physically with people in the room that you just don't pick up on a virtual and get, a virtual communication environment, because it becomes flatter. So that physical being in the room, reading the body language, reading what's going on between the lines in that energy in the room, whether it's a small group or a larger group, is actually really, really important.
Yeah.
And so that's why I also think that you are seeing more of that, because having come from a time where we were working, and of course, I was working in that virtual context long before it became so ubiquitous. I was an early adopter. But uh, I think because we all had to work through that virtual type of environment, and we're now living very much in a hybrid one. I think that people are now recognizing the difference of what gets lost or overlooked or missed if you have too much of a strong leaning towards it all being just virtual. So
Yeah, and the other thing I'm noticing is, we used to have a business culture which was Western dominated.
Mm.
Increasingly, we're engaging with people from the Middle East and South Asia and the Far East. And there, it's a really important part of the business culture to drink tea together or go and do karaoke together or go and get drunk together or whatever it is, or come home and meet the family. Those are things that I think would have been true in England 2 or 300 years ago that we've lost, but those cultures are demanding it, and very often they've got the money, and that's where the business is. So again, I think that's starting to shift, and I'm seeing again and again people who see that there's really interesting work to do in the Middle East,
Mm.
but they know they've got to go on a plane and spend 3 days drinking tea before they'll get those kinds of mandates. And then,
uh, I've even had that experience myself with working with a client out of Greece, whereby one of the business owners said to me, "Listen, Lorraine, this is how we do things here. We expect you to become part of coming into our home, to meet the family, to this is how we approach things. This is our mindset." And I was fine. This is the way you when in Rome, as the saying goes.
well, I had a client who flew me out to Brazil, and he said he'd fly me out business class. I said, "What about if I travel cattle class but bring my wife?" And she said, "Yeah, that would be great." So we went there. The
Uh-huh.
first weekend, they took us through the jungle to the beach, with the introduction to the culture. Um, the real work didn't start until Monday morning,
Yeah.
and that was just so normal and expected. And I wasn't complaining. It was really great. But I think in a lot of our Western culture, that Western business culture, we've lost that sense of the need to build relationship rather than just get stuff done.
I think from a fractional point of view, if you are working in a fractional context, I certainly regard that as one of the things that enriches that whole working experience. So I certainly don't see it as a negative. I see it as a positive. And it's really, well, I love experiencing new cultures. And it's a good interruption of your pattern of, well, just because you do it this way, because that's how you've predominantly grown up in that business environment, doesn't make it any better.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and perspective, Charles, on balancing multiple portfolios and your insights on time management and prioritizing. Can you share with our listeners where they can find you and learn more about how you support fractional executives?
Yes, the simplest thing to do is to either find me on LinkedIn, Charles McLachlan, or to find me at portfolioexecutive.biz. And we're just launching a AI expert where you can ask this expert. Any questions about second half careers and fractionals? So I'd be very interested. If anybody tries that out, tell me whether it makes any sense. But a friend of mine has built this for me, and I'd love to see whether people get any value out of it.
That would be pretty exciting to see that. There's so much happening and everything in the AI world. It's the speed of it when moving is yeah.
So, Lorraine, do you have any final thoughts about what it means to balance things as a fractional?
I think most definitely from my experience, but I would be advising to somebody who is either already at the early stage of building a fractional career or considering it, and you're looking at it in this context, look at what is your comfort zone around how you like to work and how much are you prepared to flex around that to suit different client needs. And it might be a case of, well, your fractional work is only going to be in your National Geographic location. And you may have no interest in working across multiple different cultures and jurisdictions, but have a sense of what it is you want and then where you're going to put the most energy around that so you can actually funnel that kind of work. And then also, how are you going to manage client expectations from day one? How are you going to think about how you're going to manage things when that gets flexed beyond that? Because it will happen, undoubtedly. And give some consideration around how you manage that in terms of project expansion or project creep or your commitment. Just think it through. So you're not caught on the hop, but also you are doing the kind of work you really want to do.
It's all great advice. And a final thought, recognize that different industries, different sectors, different geographies have some kind of annual cycle. And if you can recognize that and key into that, take a lot of angst out of your life as a fractional. But that's it for today's episode of the Fractional Frontier. We hope you found the conversation insightful.
Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn for more exclusive content and to catch the edited episodes on all major
You
platforms.
heard that, Lorraine.
Don't forget to subscribe. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, leave us a review or share the episode with your network. So thanks for exploring the fractional frontier with us, where leadership knows no boundaries.